Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I know a lot of folks across Texas are still in recovery mode from Storm Uri. Others are in the middle of a legislative session. So it's great to have those of you who are able to join us this morning and others that will have a chance to view this after. I'm very excited to introduce the American Flood Coalition, an initiative that I've known about for a few years in their work in different parts of the country. I'm honored to serve as an advisor to Melissa and her team, whom she'll introduce this morning as well. The American Flood Coalition, to me, represents an additional and powerful set of insights and tools for Texas as we enter, in less than 60 days, another storm and flood season. Or as I was joking earlier with Melissa, it seems to be that we never are out of completely any cycle of storm and floods. So Melissa, let me welcome you. It's been a pleasure working with you and Liz and the team, and I think this morning we'll give a chance for others to really have better insight of the role of the coalition and how those of us here in Texas can leverage this relationship and partnership. But Melissa, give me, you've got an incredible background, one that's fortuitous for now having put together the Flood Coalition. So take a few minutes to give a little bit of your background and what you've been up to before the coalition and since the coalition, and then also give a little bit of insight also of what you all have been doing under this mission.
Absolutely. And thanks, Richard, for, it's been wonderful working with you, and thank you for hosting us here today. So I can start with my background and kind of how I got here, which is intertwined, of course, with the story of the American Flood Coalition. For those who don't know me, I'm Melissa Roberts. I'm the founder and executive director of the American Flood Coalition. And I actually started out in the private sector in the infrastructure finance space. I worked at McKinsey and Company and served, a set of clients in the private sector in the US, the Caribbean, and Asia, really focused on how to catalyze private sector capital into sustainable infrastructure. And as I did more and more of that work and was focused also on some of the work coming out around the cost of investing in sustainable infrastructure, I became more and more obsessed with something that was really just a literal asterisk in our work. We were putting out reports, and I was a lead author saying, this is the cost of, globally investing in sustainable infrastructure. This is how we can fund and finance it. And then we'd say, asterisk, we don't really know the cost of adaptation, and neither does anyone else. So let's just put that to the side. And over the years, as I did more and more work in this space, that really started to bother me, that asterisk of how do we not know what this costs, especially when we're seeing the impacts so immediately. And at the same time, I was working with, cities who were saying, we know that this is going to be really expensive to adapt. We're feeling the impacts of flooding and other impacts. And we think that maybe the private sector will come in and pay for this. And at the same time, I'd be getting calls from investors saying, is there an investment thesis in adaptation in the US? And I'd say, well, no, our policy landscape's really broken. There's not a good set of bankable projects where you get your money back. And so I eventually just said, what is going on in this space and how can we possibly have so many unanswered questions? So I ended up leaving the private sector and going to First Street Foundation as their director of strategy when they were starting out, which is a nonprofit really focused on flood risk. And I thought there I was going to answer my big question, which is, where is the risk and what does it cost? And then if we answered that, people would start making better decisions and aligning investment and all these things that I have been so focused on. And what I found in that work, and they were doing incredible work and continue to do incredible work on helping understand risk and make it more transparent. But the question that I ended up focusing on there was, we're putting out better data, we're giving people better information. Why is no one making better decisions with it? And I ended up spending almost a year in a car driving around places like Florida, Virginia, the Carolinas, talking to, mayors and heads of chambers of commerce and other local leaders, asking that question, right? Why aren't you using better data to make better decisions? And invariably what people would say is, like, this is a really hard challenge, right? It's hard, like the science is hard and rapidly, changing in terms of what our impacts and exposure is. It's hard to communicate to residents. It's hard to figure out what the solutions even are. And when we know that, it's almost impossible to finance or to navigate the maze of regulations at the state and federal level. And all of that is why we created the American Flood Coalition and what we do here, which is to say, how do we try to break down all those challenges and bring together folks on the front lines of flooding, all of the stakeholders that we have, from cities and towns to elected officials at all levels, businesses, military groups, civic and academic groups, members of Congress, dealing with this at all different jurisdictions, and figure out what works, make it easy to engage with, and start tackling some of those challenges. So that's really what we do. Half of our work is engaging at the local level, helping lift up best practices, creating a network of leaders who teach each other. And then the other half is really lifting up those lessons and leaders at the local level and saying, how do we actually create better systems? Because, we can help some places navigate through this really difficult maze, but until we change state and federal policy and make it easier and make it actually, bring it into the decade that we're living in, there's no way we're going to be able to keep up with, higher seas, stronger storms, and more frequent flooding.
Melissa, I think what you all have done has been, brilliant and filled a significant gap. It's kind of this bridge, right? You've got, or multiple bridges, but you've got the data science, you've got the financing, you've got the policy and kind of rule making, and then you've got the way to, frankly, handle the implementation, to help local leaders find ways to strengthen their capabilities of implementing both policy program on one hand, but also this funding and financing issue. So I think, particular, as you know, and your team will discuss, we are also going through a phase where, again, some of these tropical storms go from a tropical storm to a hurricane in less than 24 hours. So we know we're going through some intensity. We also know that we're going through not just coastal flooding, but inland flooding. So I think it's, Melissa, this bridging effect that you all have played. Can I ask one last question? And I know we need to keep on our agenda. A year from now, 2 years from now, where do you see the coalition? Texas, where does Texas fit into your vision with the coalition as a priority?
Yeah, I mean, Texas for us is a huge priority. We only started 3 years ago, and we've been moving from our initial states into additional priority states. And for us, when we think about how this all changes and we make this better for the country, we need to be in places that are, both impacted and are kind of on the leading edge experiencing this, and coming up with solutions that can help create the models for what we need to do in other states and federally. And, there's really almost no place better than that, than Texas, to say this is a place that has unfortunately experienced the impacts, but is also coming up with a lot of really innovative ideas, some of which we've actually already been profiling and bringing to leaders in other states, and others that I think are really important to lift up federally and say we need solutions that work in places like Texas and in all of the states that are having similar challenges. So it's a big part of how we see all of this, both at the state level and the federal level, getting better.
And I want to emphasize, at a bipartisan, nonpartisan perspective, because I think that's the other almost built into the DNA of the coalition is that you all are working not only across aisles, but frankly, no aisle in between to address some of these issues. Am I saying that correctly?
Absolutely. I mean, for us, this issue, there's no way that we can do it and get the types of solutions we need if it's not bipartisan. So when you look at our membership, when you look at what we propose for policy, when you look at who sponsors it, when you look at the members of Congress that are part of the coalition, in every aspect, you can see we absolutely have, really an even split of folks from both sides of the aisle and from kind of the civil sector, military groups, business groups, and we just don't see any other way that we solve this in a sustainable way.
Right. Well, let me have Liz introduce herself, Melissa, on your team, and begin to walk us through, Liz, some of the activities generally that the Flood Coalition has been working on, and then very specific to the efforts here in Texas. So Liz, can you give a little bit of your background as well and give us a little insight on, again, your plans for us in Texas?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Richard. It's great to be here with you all. My name is Liz Casson, and I'm a senior outreach associate with the American Flood Coalition. I've been with the coalition for about a year now, primarily working on growing our membership and engagement in Texas. And before coming to the coalition, my background is in coalition building and grass tops organizing. And I've also been able to spend some time working on Capitol Hill. And just to reiterate some of what Melissa had mentioned, Texas is certainly no stranger to the impacts that flooding can have on local economies, our residents, and the infrastructure in our communities. And again, it's really from coastal to inland communities, folks are really feeling the impacts of stronger storms, more rain, and rising sea levels. And we see it, in the stat here on our slide that in Texas, there are over 1 million properties that are currently at substantial risk for flooding, and that number is only expected to increase over the next 30 years. So this is really an issue that I think is very relevant to folks in Texas, and we're really looking forward to furthering our engagement throughout the state.
And Liz, let me play off of that.
Yeah.
1.1 million plus properties. This is all kinds of properties. If I'm identifying that correctly, this is going from the industrial corridors to low to moderate income neighborhoods, and that I think is also one of the focus areas of the Flood Coalition, is to look at all of these types of floods, as well as frankly look at the various communities. So this is not just an urban, it's not just the industrial. So can you talk a little bit to that as well as and then how that plays into the membership role of the organization?
Right, and that's a great point, Richard. And some of the communities with the greatest numbers of properties at risk are really, to your point, spread out across the state. They're in Houston, in Corpus Christi, in El Paso, Dallas, Port Arthur. So what we're hoping to do is, we want to look at Texas as a whole and make the challenges of addressing flooding and sea level rise a Texas issue, and not just a Houston issue or a Corpus Christi issue or an Austin issue. And knowing that communities all across the state deal with the threat of flooding from hurricanes or heavier rainfalls, our goal is to talk with leaders about their experiences and the kinds of flood challenges that they face on a regular basis. So we've really been intentionally seeking out flood affected communities of all different types, different sizes, and different regions. And we've had the chance to connect with folks thus far in places that you'll see on the screen here in the Hill Country and in San Marcos, in places in Southeast Texas, down through the Coastal Bend and Rockport and Corpus Christi. And we've also been able to speak with folks out in West Texas in places like Lubbock, and really engage with folks from all different parts of the state to really understand those challenges that they're facing and the ways that they're seeking to become more resilient.
Yep. If you were to also look at, there's a number of organizations that are in the water space. There's a number of associations, and therefore I don't want to raise this as a competitor. I think more importantly, this is a additional source of knowledge and information. But tell me some of the things that you all have been working on that, in a sense, differentiate the Flood Coalition in your focus.
Absolutely. And, Melissa mentioned we are a national nonpartisan coalition, and we bring together leaders from all across the country. And one thing that's one part of our membership is that to join the coalition, it's free and there are no obligations to joining. And the way that we engage with our members comes in a number of different forms and looks a couple different ways. One thing that we do in concert with our members is create different guides and resources that really helps to distill some of the more complicated or complex pieces of our work. And we also, as a coalition, offer this platform for advocacy and education. And again, with such a broad and diverse group of members across the country, there's really this great network for being able to share best practices. And we also try to bring leaders together from the local, county, and state levels. And one example of this is really from our Mayor Summit that we hosted in October of 2019. We brought 20 of our mayors up to Washington, D.C., and mayors from Florida, to be able to share best practices, meet with state and federal leaders to help build strategies for resilience. And I know that our guest speaker, Dave Ashbrook, can talk a little bit more about the Mayor Summit in a little bit. And we also, through our membership, we've also supported different local resilience pilots for some of our members. And we also want to be able to offer talking points and data points for leaders in flood affected communities to really raise and elevate the issues in the towns and counties and states that we're working in.
Let's talk a little bit. I know you're going to go into some of these, the tools and reports, but I think one of the key elements, and again, David Ashbrook from Florida is going to cover a little bit of that. But as you begin to build out the membership in the network here in Texas, what should be their expectations as members and participants, and what would you all like to benefit back from having more voices and more interest out of Texas?
No, absolutely. And again, I mentioned some of the ways that we work with our members, but again, in Texas, folks across the state really, understand and feel the impacts of the challenges presented from flooding and sea level rise. And I think folks in Texas, the way that they can engage with our membership, it comes in a couple different forms. We have, for our members, we put out a newsletter that we try to highlight different funding opportunities, different pieces of legislation moving through state houses and Congress. And we also try to highlight communities from our membership that are implementing a new particular strategy. And if there are communities in Texas that are members of the coalition, those are definitely places that we want to highlight within our membership. And we also, within our membership, across different states, we really try to find opportunities to facilitate collaboration and connections between mayors or other leaders if there's overlap on a particular issue. So I think folks from Texas really bring a unique voice and a unique experience to our membership. And we're really excited about some of the progress that we've made as we've continued to grow and engage with folks throughout the state.
Liz, I want to let folks know that if they have questions of the team now, either use the chat or the Q&A boxes that are available for you at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I jokingly say, if you don't know where the chat or Q&A boxes are on a Zoom screen, then you haven't been doing enough Zooms as everybody has this year. But also, if you have some follow-up questions, you'll see at the end of the presentation the contact information. But let's jump to, because I really want to make sure folks get a chance to see a little bit more in depth about these educational tools, the reports, which are probably some of the best reports we've seen about impacts, and then also some of the funding sources. So walk us through this kind of next stage of where the impact of the coalition has in the way of providing information, again, to a variety. And I want to emphasize, Liz, that this is intentional to provide a broad set of interest. Some of our, as you know, we have over 7,000 water utilities in the state of Texas, and a majority of those are sitting in, rural communities that don't have access to some of this expertise. So I think, walk us through, if you would.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, Richard, one of the pieces of our broader work with our members is really communicating with them and hearing about what resources and what information is most helpful for them as they're trying to address the challenges presented in their communities. And we try to put out resources and guides that can be scalable across different communities and different types of members throughout our membership. And the resources that we put out and the information we put out come in a number of different formats. And so one is through interactive tools, which we'll talk about, our flood funding finder. We've also put out different white papers, case studies, guides, reports, to really try and tackle, again, some of the more complicated issues that we face, and also help to provide solutions and ways that our members can continue to fund resilience and continue to be more resilient in the face of, again, stronger storms and rising sea levels. So one thing I'll note very quickly is we put out a number of different blogs on our blog page called the Coalition Current. And it really focuses on different best practices and some different pieces of legislation that are moving through Congress. And some of our more recent posts, we've highlighted FEMA's new BRIC program, and we've also looked at some of the actions taken by Houston and Harris County following Hurricane Harvey to make those communities more resilient. And one of our more recent guides that was actually just released last week is called our Adaptation for All guide. And this was created in partnership with Arcadis and the Dutch Embassy. And this guide highlights 26 examples from across the country and some examples in the Netherlands about how communities are addressing flood resilience. And it offers a number of different strategies for those communities to become more resilient.
Fantastic. And Liz, I think what I love is these factoids, is what I call them. I hate to call them bumper stickers, but what you all have done so well is to take a lot of complex information and try to really simplify it in a way. So this one about the 1 million invested creates 40 jobs. I think, from elected and appointed officials who are having to explain the necessary impacts of investing in flood resilience, these kinds of points I think are critical. Talk a little bit about the Flood Finder. I think that's an essential additional tool that you all have.
Absolutely. So the Flood Funding Finder, this was a resource that was actually an idea of one of our members, one of our elected officials in Florida. And what she said is that there needs to be more clarity around what federal programs are best suited for smaller communities. So what we've done with the Flood Funding Finder is take a look at a number of different federal grant programs and offer a number of different filters for communities to select what kind of funding avenue they're looking for, and give a couple of different criteria that they can look at to help identify what the right grant to fund flood resilience is in their community. Right. So I'll move to the next slide here and just show you a little bit of what the Flood Funding Finder looks like on our website. And when you use the website, again, you can filter out based on a number of different criteria. And it'll give you this list of different federal grant opportunities that you can look at and see really which fits your needs. And again, this is certainly helpful for communities of all different sizes, but really geared towards those smaller communities of about 50,000 or less. And you can download a customized PDF of all of the different programs that you've selected based on which criteria you've had. And you can share that with leaders in your community.
Liz, I want to spend a little extra minute or two on this because I think it is so substantial. as I looked at it again yesterday, we tend to think about that a bulk of the funding is coming from FEMA, coming from HUD, but there really are a lot of sources of funding. Number one, a lot of additional funding sources that continue to emerge. We're going to be seeing a lot of new infrastructure spending, and we'll talk with Melissa about that in a little bit, in Matthew. But also, it seems to be that the rules and the requirements for these different grants and programs change. So I'm assuming that this is constantly updated, which makes this also a great tool. Talk a little bit about how you all have seen Flood Finder kind of begin to work. I know it produces some great reports that can, but tell me kind of your read on how it's being used now.
Yeah, I think, we released it last fall, and we've received a lot of really positive feedback from a number of our members and other partners about how it operates and how it functions. And to your point, yes, Richard, it's certainly something that we want to keep up to date as different deadlines change and different criteria are implemented for different types of programs. But we've received a lot of really positive feedback, and we're really excited about the way that this really, again, helps to kind of cut through some of the more complicated pieces of the federal granting programs and different options that smaller communities have. And we find that it's a great resource for some of those communities that don't have a full-time dedicated staff to be able to spend a lot of time on these types of projects.
I also kind of find this as again, I was thinking about this yesterday. It's also kind of a roadmap that the federal, you're seeing how the funding is coming, from the agencies in Congress, and eventually this flows down to the state and local communities. So I really thought that this is almost like a roadmap. It begins to give you a start where this plays out in your communities. Number one, and number two, it also identifies what you've got to do to be prepared to go after one of these grants, because I think that's one of the challenges that a lot of communities are still trying to put in their minds is that what does it mean to be a community of 50,000 or less versus a community of a couple 100,000. So I commend y'all for doing this and the powerfulness of that. I know you're going to stay with us, Liz, throughout this. Is there, before we jump back and talk a little bit about the policy pieces, is there anything I'm missing, one or two items I'm missing in all of the portfolio here?
I will just very quickly mention, Richard, you alluded to the report from Johns Hopkins University that we worked with them on, that really for the first time quantifies how flood resilient or investments in flood resilient infrastructure projects can help boost local economies and create jobs. And you see the statistic here: for every $1 million invested, 40 jobs are created. And the report also does a breakdown for every congressional district in the US about how many jobs are created versus the investment. And then one last resource I will mention is our Turning the Tide white paper. And this really looks at gaps and ways that we can improve and create more equity in our federal disaster recovery policies. I know my colleague Rolando is on the line here, and Melissa, I think, already shared the link to the Flood Funding Finder, but I know Rolando can drop all of the links to these resources that we've talked about into the chat, so folks can have the chance to navigate through and take a look at some of the products that we've put out. And I think he may have just dropped those in there now.
And Liz, I think we've had a chance to discuss this, is that the ability to pinpoint the low and moderate income neighborhoods, which remain, quite vulnerable in certain parts of the state of Texas. I think, there's been some increasing attention given to this in the federal grant programs and all. And I commend y'all for not being shy about raising the issue, but more importantly, not just raising it, but beginning to identify some solutions. And I think, again, that's one of the powerful aspects of the coalition, is to find out how other communities, other states are rectifying, this gap, but also, similar other gaps. So thank you, Liz, for sharing that. Melissa, that gives us a chance to bring you and Matthew, AFC's policy director, who will get a chance to introduce himself in a minute. But I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about some of the policies, but I also want to raise one of the things that you and I had a chance to talk about that's really emerged in Texas. And I think it's not just something for us in Texas, but seems to be prevalent in different parts of the country. And that is that with all of these different funding mechanisms and grant programs, sometimes, unfortunately, there's a misalignment, right, of expectations or rulemaking or how it ultimately implements. That's one side of the issue, and the other side is the timelines by which these funds actually can get out into the hands of the local community. So talk a little bit more about the policy work that you all are doing and how you and Matthew see this playing out for Texas as well.
Yeah. And what you raised there, Richard, is a great point, because a lot of those pieces, right, there's the idea, which is, sometimes good, sometimes not good, but sometimes we do have good ideas and there's funding put into what seems like good programs. And then what you find is when the rubber meets the road and people actually have to fill out the 500-page grant application, and then they get told that, if you don't spend the money within this time frame and put in this match, and actually you're disqualified because you shouldn't have taken money from that pot and this pot, like, it just doesn't work, especially for, anywhere outside of the biggest, most well-resourced communities. So a lot of those kind of what actually happens on the ground is how we developed our policy platform, with our membership. So we were saying, when we look across the communities we work in, what are these common challenges, right? And there's a lot to choose from, because as many people who I'm sure, joining this webinar know, most of our flood policy either doesn't exist, it's not a coherent policy, or it dates to the 1970s or earlier, including a lot of really important pieces like some of our mapping, which a lot of regulations at all levels get based on. And so it just hasn't kept up with what we've seen in terms of higher seas, stronger storms, more frequent flooding, everything we've seen play out in Texas. It's just not kind of up to snuff for what we're dealing with today. And so there's a lot of places that can be changed with consensus-driven bipartisan ideas that make sense. But, Richard, as you and I talk about a lot, unfortunately, even if there are common sense ideas, even if they save money, nothing changes in DC unless you fight for it. So that's kind of where we come in, right? There's nothing that changes, even if it's a good idea, unless you have a coalition and advocacy and you're really pressing to make these improvements. So that's what we do across our policy portfolio, is really say, how do we lift up these places where there are problems? We do, of course, need a lot more funding. We also need it to not be torturous for communities to get and implement. We also need this to be kind of at a regional scale, right? We can't think water does not respect jurisdictional boundaries. We can't be thinking of this as each, pinpoint city on its own fighting for these solutions that don't speak to each other across watersheds, right? We just need to change the way that we think about this pretty systemically.
Let me play off of something as well, because we happen to be a state that has still a lot of military presence. We go from Fort Hood and which is one of the largest bases in the country. We have Naval Air Station, which is more than just the Naval Air Station. I think it's great that you all have had such an emphasis on looking at how other states and communities have dealt with supporting their military bases and frankly, the derivatives of, so to speak, the military economy that so I want to make sure I emphasize, Melissa, that, you know, because of the base commands that we have in Texas, it's great that you all have put that time and attention to that as well.
Yeah, and I'll just offer that up actually, as that was the very first piece of policy we ever worked on as a coalition. And it's a great example, I think, of how we think about policy. So I'll use that as just one example where, you know, one of the early states we were working in was Virginia. Virginia is, of course, home to Norfolk Naval Base. And, you know, in Norfolk, what's happening is there's one access road to get to the base, and it's flooding 10 times a year so badly that it's actually preventing people from getting onto the base. And so you would think that this is an easy problem to solve, right? You can't have that critical road flooding. It's a national security issue. This is the greatest naval base in the world. But, you know, you look at the rules and there's a lot of flexibility within the perimeter of the base to make these adjustments, and they've actually put a lot of money to that. But this access road doesn't fall in that category. And there's only one funding program that allows the base commander to make changes to these access roads, and flooding and sea level rise wasn't written into that program. So because of what's kind of an oversight in this rule, you have this really bad problem that's affecting our military readiness. And that doesn't get changed unless we can bring everyone together and actually push for it. And we did, and it passed, you know, on a voice vote, no objections through. We got the change to the program. And we know that it matters in more than Virginia. And that's kind of how we drive policy, is going and listening to these problems that are happening locally, help organize people and lift them up so we can get these fixes, but then also make sure that those fixes aren't just for the one, just for Norfolk, but say this is relevant for bases around the country. We actually know there are hundreds of military bases and installations in the US that are affected by similar challenges and need this sort of flexibility.
And I think that's overall one of the powers of aligning Texas and the flood coalition, is this common voice, this common ability to get, more than just Texas, pounding on the table as advocates for some of this work. And again, I think you've heard me say this, Melissa, you're not our lobbyist. All right, but you bring, as has been emphasized, a lot of peers across the country at the federal, congressional level, down to the state and local on these issues. And I think the more the voices are organized, and supported by the coalition, we can make some of these changes and improvements where there are some policy gaps, but also take a look at as things continue to evolve, what else do we need to be working on? Sad but true. That opens the door for you in Matthew, and I'd like Matthew to, if he would, introduce himself, because he's got the fun day in and day out job, right, Melissa, of keeping track of what this new administration is unfolding in the way of some of the grant programs and what's happening on the Hill. Matthew, introduce yourself and then give a little bit of your quick perspective of what is emerging, what seems to be underway that we need to be tracking.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so I worked on the Hill for about 6.5 years before joining the coalition, including as legislative director for a member from the Houston delegation. And actually working for that member, I handled disaster preparedness, response, and recovery issues, and got to see firsthand the impact events such as Hurricane Harvey, the Tax Day floods, Memorial Day floods, and more recent events, the impact that those things have on Texans. And that experience is what I bring to my job and the perspective I bring as policy director for AFC. And I think, right now, what we're looking at most is an infrastructure package that Congress is beginning to work on, and we're likely to see move at some point in the coming months. This is an opportunity to enact the type of transformational changes that need to occur to make communities more resilient to flooding, sea level rise, and natural disasters. And we really feel that flood resilient infrastructure is something that needs to be included in any infrastructure package. These are the types of investments that will support local economies, will reduce costs associated with disasters, and it will make us more prepared for decades to come. As was mentioned earlier with the Johns Hopkins report, we also know that these types of investments create jobs. If we invest $1 billion in flood resilient infrastructure, we could create as many as 40,000 jobs. That's a really important point, especially if Congress wants to use infrastructure to spur a post-COVID economic recovery. These are the types of investments that need to be made. And also I think it's something you alluded to earlier, but infrastructure is also an opportunity for us to address some of the issues that we see in existing programs. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is investments in the pre-development stages of projects. And what I mean by that is everything that comes before construction occurs. These are all of it's the business plans, environmental reviews, analysis, grant writing, the things that need to occur to ensure that construction can actually happen. And unfortunately, what we've routinely heard from members, from communities, and local governments is that the federal government doesn't do enough to support these stages of project development. So what we are really engaged on and trying to proactively address with federal policymakers is putting more funding towards the pre-development stages of projects to help smaller, rural, underserved communities access federal funding. And if we don't get that, if we don't address this pre-development issue, we really are concerned that there's going to be communities that are just shut out of any infrastructure funding because they just don't have the resources to compete with bigger and more, and bigger cities with a lot of more capacity.
Yeah, but Matthew, go right to that point. And I think this is something that we've all had a chance to talk about. As the BRIC program emerges, as the HUD CDBG MIT program, as these other programs that are now going to focus finally and increasingly on pre-disaster risk mitigation, right? If the associated infrastructure financing impedes that ability to do pre-disaster risk mitigation at the design level, we're once again kind of, it's almost counterintuitive. Am I making sense? That I think that the idea what you all are emphasizing is really critical as the alignment occurs towards more pre-disaster risk mitigation.
Absolutely, and I think and this is something that I think Melissa touched on earlier, and that you spoke to as well, is that we haven't seen as much investment in flood mitigation, adaptation until recently, like with BRIC. BRIC is a great new program, but this is the first year that BRIC investments are happening. So we're just seeing the federal government start to turn towards resiliency. And I think if we need, it's right now is going to be the critical moment that we address pre-development to help communities build the technical capacity to apply for these types of grants, to understand how they can address their resilience issues with federal funding. And this is the moment for us to get that support to them, to build the capacity for long term and really help them have a positive impact on their communities.
I hate to say this, Matthew, and share this also for Melissa's observations. After living in Washington, D.C. for 27 years and coming back home, I walked away with an observation that it's sad but true that most of the innovations in federal agencies are found through waivers. And the sad part is waivers are very temporary. So I think, you know, as the coalition and partners across the country really, you know, speak up to this, I sense there is an opportunity, Melissa, that, you know, why are we doing things on a temporary basis through these waivers versus the ability for us to really make some of these things more permanent? And as Matthew said, helps guide some of the smaller communities that really need these pre-design or early stage resources better. So Melissa, you know, from yours and Matthew's perspective, it seems like there's a big agenda. We just got asked, one of the questions we were asked, and I'm wondering how this plays out for you and Matthew, is obviously the coalition focuses at the federal and congressional level. How does this interplay with state and local policy making? How does this either inform or engage with, you know, the connection of how this plays out, or what kind of impact at the state and local levels?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll start just by saying we focus on state policy and local policy as well. We think state policy is incredibly important and have been really focused there in the states we work. So in Florida, in North and South Carolina, in Virginia. And a lot of that's because, you know, you're speaking about innovation. A lot of the innovative ideas that make their way to the federal level have to be proven first at the state and local level. So that's a big focus. And then once those, you know, have been tested, we can help pull them to the federal level. But, you know, besides some of these really big funding programs that often have to come down federally, almost everything needs to start at the state and local level first. So that's a really big focus for us, is doing both, is saying, how do we, you know, when there's things that are clear, how do we clear obstacles at the federal level so things are easier for folks working at the state and local level, but also how do we invest in innovative ideas and new ways of doing things at the state and local level that can make their way up and change how we do things federally? Because otherwise, if we try to just shift and make small waivers incrementally in how we do things federally, we'll never get there fast enough. We have to put in place these new innovative ideas at the state level that can come kind of bubbling up to the federal level.
Right. So that, as we talked about at the very beginning, this is a bridging effect. Well, let's take advantage of one of the bridges. I had a chance to visit with Dave Ashbrook in Port St. Joe, Florida, and I'm pumped, Dave, that not only have you joined us, but you've joined us from the beach side in Florida. Dave, as you and I talked a little bit, and want to make sure you introduce yourself and share some of the key points that we talked about. Some folks may not know where Port St. Joe is, but they probably have heard of Mexico Beach and the challenges of being hit straight on by a hurricane. So again, this is not a compare and contrast. This is, okay, what did we learn and what are some of the things that we can jointly share? So David, thank you so much for joining us. Take a little bit of time to introduce yourself and share with us some of the work that you've been doing through and with the coalition.
Sure, thanks, Richard. Like you said, Port St. Joe, little coastal town, just east of Panama City, Florida, probably the most known. And that beach scene behind me is not what it looks like today. We just dealt with a tornado this morning, and my roads are flooded today. So, and the storms don't discriminate. Texas, Florida, we all have the same issues. This is a nationwide, coastal and interior problem. And so far, my experience with AFC has been excellent. I lobby here locally in Tallahassee for my constituents here in Port St. Joe, and you're kind of my federal arm. I count on y'all to help us out and direct me on funding sources. This whole thing really started after Hurricane Michael hit us in October of 2018, and we were struggling. We didn't know, where the grants were going to be coming from. A lot of them, the timing wasn't right. We just got qualified for CDBG money, the DR grants, and that took a long process. But we have successfully because of AFC, got a grant for stormwater management. We received about $900,000 from Northwest Florida Water Management to do a master stormwater runoff plan, as well as build a little retention area to treat the water before it goes out into our bay. So that was a great help. Then we got we have grants in application form for moving our city hall, as well as our police and fire department to higher ground. We were about 6 feet underwater after Hurricane Michael. We were a very ineffective department post-storm. But the grant finding tool, amazing tool that you guys put together. I've utilized about half of those grants that are on that list already. One thing I loved about this group, the contacts that I've made when we did the mayor summit up in Washington, D.C. I was introduced, surprisingly, the secretary of the DEP showed up. Noah Valenstein showed up from the state of Florida, and that was an unexpected surprise. I met, Jeff Andrew Carney, who's part of the fiber program for the University of Florida. His students are now every semester bringing new students up doing a study on resiliency here. So they've helped, and they're applying for grants on our behalf as well. I have nothing but positive things to say about this group. It has been a major help to our community, and it needs to keep growing. There's power in large numbers, and with a voice as strong as AFC's, I'm glad that you're on my side.
Well, David, let me play off one or two things that you and I had a chance to mention that you raised here. Florida with AFC organized this mayor summit, and I think, as you just alluded to, it was an opportunity, frankly, for a number of Floridians to get together, share some notes across what is a big state, go to Washington, have conversations with the congressional delegation and some of the agencies. Lesson learned, I guess, out of that is that peer-to-peer knowledge sharing, peer-to-peer, and even on a confidential level. I think that's something you and I talked about, the ability to kind of openly discuss, look, we're having a challenge here, is the same kind of challenge you're having there. So am I hitting some of the key takeaways that you and I talked about?
Absolutely. And I'm still in contact with some of the mayors from the summit. We regularly talk. There were problems in South Florida that we don't necessarily have up here, but we have problems that they may not have. And it was really eye-opening to see the different struggles that these other cities have.
Yeah, and I think, David, one of the things that, as we begin to wrap up, Liz, getting a David Ashbrook in Port St. Joe with a Mayor Pat Rios in Rockport, which is almost the equivalent. I mean, it's almost like a mirror community, where Rockport was, hit hard by the initial version, the first version of Harvey. David, so thank you for your offer to be, accessible to other small communities, in Texas, and for some knowledge sharing. So thank you for that offer, of which I know we and Liz will obviously take up. Liz, we've got 2 minutes, and one question that I want to raise that's come across is, one of the challenges about Texas is we're big, like Florida, which also means we're fragmented, like Florida, from different regions and different communities. We have the state has now instituted a regional flood planning, not just a overall water planning. So one of the questions is asked is, how will this integrate in with regional planning? And I think one of the ways, Liz, that that question emphasizes is your ability to be available as a resource through the Flood Coalition to any of these regional groups and regional organizations. I think that's one of your offers and one of your resources that I think you've shared with me. Am I saying that also?
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. And, as Melissa mentioned, water doesn't, abide by jurisdictional boundaries. And we've seen that in other states. Working in a regional and in a collaborative way has been very beneficial to making sure that there is resilience across a particular region and across county and city lines. So that's, certainly something that we're eager to learn more and engage more with folks in Texas that are working at a regional level. And not only in the regional planning, but I know that there are a lot of councils of governments that are also working across different county lines on a host of different issues, of course, but really around resilience. So I think, really honing in on the value and the benefit of working across regions in a collaborative way is really critical to furthering the resilience of the community and the state as a whole.
Right. And I think, Liz, one other quick point, and I know you're going to share contact points for the team before we wrap up, but Texas, again, like Florida, a preponderance of this state is private sector. A preponderance of this state also has a variety of ways for which flood mitigation, flood management. So for instance, we have a lot of municipal utility districts that work with developers, that, we have significant large scale planned communities. And I think I want to make sure what's emphasized here is that there is a component and emphasis on elected and appointed officials, but just as much for the Flood Coalition to work with civic and business organizations and chambers and such, because I think, again, this kind of public-private partnership that really has to further and strengthen in Texas and across the country if we're going to be a fully resilient country. So I want to emphasize also, Liz, the role that the AFC offers to play and participate with business and civic organizations as well.
Absolutely, Richard. And yeah, to your point, it's, we engage a lot with mayors and county and state elected officials, but certainly in other parts of the country, working with business associations, chambers of commerce, military leaders, and academic institutions as well. It's really a diverse group of stakeholders that are coming together to help drive change and adaptation to these really pressing challenges that we all know are really facing Texas and
as a
other parts of the country.
As a UT Longhorn, I must emphasize that our first academic cohort members on board are our friends at Texas A&M, which is great to have them on board. And as you know, Liz, you've got a list of contacts and some follow-up, not only out of previous sessions, but follow-up out of today with a number of the other academic institutions that have been playing a critical role with flood mitigation. So Liz, any quick last observations?
I know we're a couple minutes over, so I will keep it very brief, but I just want to thank, folks who are joining us here and folks who will watch the recording of our webinar. We're really excited about the chance to engage with you all in Texas. And please do not hesitate to reach out if there was a question that was asked that we didn't have a chance to get to, or if there's any additional follow-up. We are happy to schedule additional conversations. And again, Richard, appreciate the opportunity to have this platform and really looking forward to our continued work together and to continue to grow our presence throughout the state of Texas.
Well, thank you all for doing this. Thank you all for taking the time. I know there's a lot going on for our participants, our listeners. As I shared, Liz, we're still in recovery mode. We're in the middle of a legislative session. You and I have had a chance to talk with a couple of the state senators and a couple of the state representatives. We're also in the middle of spring break. So I appreciate the time that you all have spent doing this. And I know we have a number of other follow-on questions. So don't hesitate to reach back to folks at the Flood Coalition or myself. With that, I think we're covered a lot of territory in an hour. So Melissa, Liz, Matthew, Dave, thank you so much for your time this morning. Thank you for being interested in helping us move further along in Texas, and also for us to share some of the best practices and things that we've developed here. So thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard.